Welcome to the special DUB Business Talk session as part of the Ignite 2034 Future Book project. Today, we are in for an enlightening conversation with the American economist, Professor Michael Spence. Hello, Mr. Spence. Or hello, Michael.
Hello, it's nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Professor Spence is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 2001 for his groundbreaking work on the relationship between information and markets. He is also co-author of the compelling book Perma-Crisis, A Plan to Fix a Fractured World. Professor Spence's insights have significantly influenced economic discussions. Our talk today is a preview of the upcoming book, Ignite 2034. We are gathering insights from global thought leaders to offer you a sneak peek into the future, revealing how our lives and work will transform in the next decade. Dear Mike, we are excited to explore the future with you, touching on topics like generative AI and the dynamics of the world's three largest markets, the US, China, and Germany. But before we dive into these fascinating topics, a quick question. Mike, could you give us a brief elevator pitch style explanation of the adverse selection concept that you earned your recognition?
Well, I'd be delighted to try. So, people like me always get to be sort of nerds, a little bit. So the three of us received the Nobel Prize in 2001. The concept of, or the phenomenon of adverse selection have been known in the insurance industry for some time. Basically, the problem in many markets, including insurance markets, is that the insurer knows less about the actual health conditions of the person who's being insured, or their driving habits, or whatever. And so the pricing reflects the average. And then the people, who are careful drivers or are very healthy find that pricing is not very attractive. And so they may leave the market. So they select themselves out of the market, and exactly the people you don't want to leave the market so select themselves out, hence the term adverse. So turns out that phenomenon is very common in a wide range of markets in finance and other places. And the source of it's always the same, which is that there's real product differentiation of some kind in the market that's very hard for the buying side of the market to see. And if they can't see it, then it's like an asset class. They lump them all together and the pricing reflects the average. And then people select themselves in or out of the market. In the extreme cases, adverse selection will take a market apart completely. There's nothing left. George Akerlof wrote the famous paper called The Market for Lemons, with the application of this to the used car market, where there's clear, enormous variation in the quality of the vehicles that's being offered. It's very difficult for the buyer to distinguish. The two other people, Joe Stiglitz and I, sort of went after the problem. Well, is that all there is to it, or do sometimes markets solve this problem in some way or another? So what I discovered is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes in markets, you get a signaling phenomenon. And signaling basically consists of people who somehow want to communicate, which version of the product that they're selling, find something they can do that's visible, that distinguishes them from other people. And that works, essentially. I mean, if you kind of cut to the chase, when that's something that they can do has costs that are negatively correlated with the quality of whatever it is that's being sold that's hard to see. If you take away the negative cost correlation, then everybody has the same incentives, and the signal won't survive in the marketplace. Joe approached the same problem, but kind of flipped the coin over. So that version of it's called screening, but it's the same idea. And so what this kind of work ends up, being in kind of contract theory with asymmetric information and so on. But that's the core of it. And I guess, there's been a lot of work since then. Markets solve this problem in different ways. Signaling's one, screening's another, intermediaries with reputations is a third, regulation, direct regulation that changes the incentive structure. Basically in financial markets, there are a whole bunch of disclosure regulations that require people with superior information to disclose it to the investors, because that market probably doesn't solve that problem at least not efficiently in other ways.
Let's jump ourselves into the future with you, Mike.
The first question for you, it's about economy. Humanity has had to overcome many crises in the recent years: productivity slowdown, COVID, Ukraine conflict, Israel, inflation, aging populations. You yourself, as a co-author of the book Permacrisis, plan to fix the fractured world. What is your plan to heal the world?
Well, so I think it's a very confusing environment. So you have these multiple shocks coming from climate, pandemics, whatnot. You have geopolitical tensions and not infrequent financial crises. We may have, we'll certainly have mini versions of that coming, in the next few years, especially in the low income countries. Anyway, so that's one set of things. Second, you have, big sort of secular structural changes underway. And then finally, you have at least three sort of scientific and technologically driven revolutions underway, a kind of multi-dimensional digital one over decades. And we'll probably want to talk about the latest version of that. There's a revolution in biomedical and life sciences that's attracting a lot of investment and interest and having huge impacts. I mean, the development of vaccines in an astonishingly short time would be an example of that. And then you have the technology side of this massive energy transition that we have to go through in order to achieve some version of sustainability. And all of those things are going on at the same time. So Gordon Brown and Mohamed El-Erian and I, those are my two co-authors. Gordon's former Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Mohamed's a chief economic advisor to Allianz and a kind of genius on the kind of global macro and financial kind of conditions. So we kind of complement each other. And we wrote a book basically to suggest that, we were making mistakes, missing important structural changes, not responding ideally to these kinds of shocks and so on. We didn't want to leave anybody with the impression that there was a silver bullet that, I could give you, or any one of us could give you a one-sentence summary of how to fix everything. That's just ridiculously arrogant if anybody said that. What we did suggest is that we could do a better job of understanding the environment that we're in and, taking many steps kind of in the right direction. And so that was the goal: help people understand, not get trapped in, models that applied to the past but didn't apply. Let me just give you a quick example. We lived for, at least 3 or 4 decades in a world that had relatively little inflationary pressure. And the reason for that is we had enormous increments of productive capacity, particularly in the tradable side of the global economy. And that produced demonstrable, and we talk about them with data in the book, deflationary pressures. So you have basically a generation and a half of people in policymaking positions, in financial markets, and in business who've never lived in an inflationary environment. And mindsets get, pretty firmly entrenched when you do that. So when you have a big change of the type that we experienced as we pulled out of the pandemic with a surge in demand and a supply side that didn't react the way we expected, then you get, all kinds of mistakes until the mindsets catch up. So that was an important part of the purpose of writing the book, even if nobody has kind of complete answers. But that's where we were going. Focus on the structural changes, help people adjust their mindsets to the emerging reality that we're in, and try to bring these, shocks, structural changes, and big technological transformations into some kind of focus.
You also wrote a very interesting paper about the influence of artificial intelligence in the future. And the question is, do you think that technologies such as Gen AI lead us to a life of paradise? Because AI will solve all the major problems and challenges such as climate change, wars, production slowdowns, and diseases. Will everything be better in 2034? than it is today?
Well, I don't want to oversell this, but I think we relatively rarely do you get handed a set of tools that have not only the power that these tools have. I'm talking about Gen AI now. I mean, Gen AI is the end of a sequence of breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, all of which rely on neural networks and deep learning algorithms. So we had speech recognition, image recognition was an enormously important breakthrough around 2015, 2016. That's when the AIs passed the average human in visually identifying objects. And now we have the family of Gen AI things, large language models. They're about to become multimodal. So why do I think there's huge potential in this? It's very hard to find a place in the economy or indeed in the scientific and technological world where there aren't, significant applications of these kinds of tools. And, while they're a little bit expensive now, and they're very expensive to train, all of those costs will go down in a pattern that we're familiar with in the digital world. So the paper that I wrote with James Monique at Google, he's an old friend, this basically said, well, let's take one of the dimensions of that. We have labor shortages in Germany. We have labor shortages all over the place in the United States. The supply side seems to be less elastic than we thought it was. The old people are retiring in droves. We're sort of aging, dependency ratios are going up. Is there a solution to this? And it seems to me, one possible solution is a very large reversal of the downward trend in productivity growth and actually a huge surge. And I think that's possible. Is it inevitable? No. We have to overcome lots of things to get there. There's a huge automation bias everywhere. I mean, people think, well, what are we going to use these things for? Well, we're going to use them to replace people. And that sort of comes naturally. Eric Brynjolfsson, my colleague at Stanford, calls this the Turing trap because basically Alan Turing proposed that we assess progress in AI by asking the question, how close are we to producing a machine that when the machine interacts with a person, the person thinks they're talking to another person, right? Stretch goal. And indeed, AIs are always benchmarked against human performance. I mean, how well are we doing in image recognition? Do we pass the average human? And over again. Does the AI do a better job of taking the law school aptitude test? It's a test you take to get into law school in the United States. Yes or no? That's okay. It's a natural way to benchmark progress in AI. It's the next step that people almost automatically take, which is, well, once the machine passes the human, why don't we get rid of the human? That's the automation bias. With the natural use of these things is as digital assistants, as powerful, machine-human collaborators. Sometimes they're superhuman. Sometimes they're about the same as humans. Sometimes they're below human. And if we had more time, I could give you examples where all the above are useful. But basically, if we equip enough people with powerful digital assistants, digital assistants that write the first draft of a doctor's report or a computer code or whatever, then we could get an enormous productivity surge. The reason it's not inevitable, and then I'll sort of stop at this, is, in past, cases of digital adoption, with previous well-known technologies, routine job automation and so on, you had huge diversion, in the pattern of adoption. So tech, high levels of adoption, financial sector, high levels of adoption. And then you drop down to kind of the government, and the healthcare sector, and, they're kind of treading water or some version of that, much, much slower. If we get that pattern again, and we could, because JP Morgan and Allianz are going to spend tens of millions of dollars experimenting with this in this period of experimentation and exploration. The small and medium-sized businesses don't have the resources to do that, right? So if the public policy, agenda continues to be, this is really dangerous stuff, we better sort of regulate it and make sure it doesn't do it, and it is dangerous in certain kinds of ways. And we don't have, a program to make sure that this is accessible and understandable to a wide range of institutions in our economy, then we may not get the result. So yeah, the short answer to your question is there's huge potential here, in scientific research. AI is going to merge with parts of biomedical science and produce stunning breakthroughs and so on. But it could be spotty or it could be across the board. And what we need to do is try to make sure it's across the board in the economy as we can.
Forward thinkers such as Yuval Harari believe that we are heading for a better life in the long term thanks to technology. However, we will have to overcome many major and minor crises before then, not all which we will survive. Do you think that
Fair enough.
he is right with his suggestion or with his what he's thinking, that we are facing a revolution and that in this revolution we will see a lot of wars, a lot of tension and a lot of crisis because of this change?
I think I certainly agree that any major technology, really big, new, powerful one, has two characteristics. It's extremely disruptive because you have to change a lot of things. People have to change the work they do. Some jobs disappear or there are fewer of them, etc. And that's turbulent, and it can, if it's not handled well, meaning in a way that protects people and helps them make these transitions, then it can give rise to sort of political and social turmoil as well. So I agree with that. And secondly, their big, powerful technologies are always dangerous. I mean, forget about AI for a minute. Gene editing is, an enormously important technology that was discovered in the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, two women, received the Nobel Prize in chemistry for discovering it. By the way, I mean, at least I find these things interesting. They weren't trying to study gene editing. They were studying bacteria. And it turns out bacteria know how to edit genes because they're attacked by viruses. That's how they found this. This is, CRISPR-9 technology. You can really misuse this technology and make it a pretty dangerous thing, right? So that this notion that we have to sort of tread lightly, regulate, self-regulate in the case of the biomedical science people, that's all correct. I mean, it's not just all wonderful. It's always a double-edged sword. The only part I guess I might, sort of veer off from Harari's assessment is I don't think it's inevitable that, these technologies will sort of tear the world apart in the dimensions that matter. I mean, I don't think we have to let geopolitical tensions get out of hand. I don't think we have to sort of marginalize all the multilateral institutions that we need, to navigate into a kind of uncertain future and so on. So maybe I'm just an excessive optimist in that respect, but I think we can do better than we've been doing in the recent past.
Yeah, there's also been a lot of discussion about the metaverse in the recent years. Do you think that it will one day dominate our lives? Will we then be sitting opposite each other in 4K quality and believe that we are really in the same room one day?
I don't. Honestly, I think human beings have a rather important set of, very deeply built-in preferences or characteristics or desires to have contact with other people. So I think the metaverse is, an important set of developments, and it's another set of tools. We can probably, using the metaverse, go shopping and try on clothing without, actually being there and so on. And so I think it's part of the kind of digital revolution. But this notion that, at least it doesn't ring a bell with me, the notion that, I can live my life in my office, sort of, and my interaction with other people is confined to that. My experience also, because I've spent a lot of time in various parts of the world, because of the interest in economic growth and development, is when I'm there, I always learn something that, I can't learn, on Zoom, video calls, reading, and so on. Now, I found the same thing with AI, by the way. I mean, there's a ton of stuff written about AI, but I have colleagues at Stanford who are sort of doing these things. And I thought, if I'm really going to understand this, I need to get back and understand what they're actually think they're doing and how they're going about it and what they think the next steps are. So in multiple dimensions, my experience, maybe I'm just, an older generation that doesn't get it yet, but but my experience tells me that there's something special, at least for now, that comes from contact with people.
Let's talk about artificial intelligence, the big topic of our time. Can you remember the moment when you first realized the full potential of AI? Was there a very specific moment for you?
No, it came in stages for me, because I had been, anybody who's interested in growth, it would be kind of hard to be sort of ignore it. So, and it wasn't just artificial intelligence. I mean, you've had big structural changes in economies, basically starting in the late 90s, because in the late 90s, the internet became kind of public property. All of this stuff about whose network's going to dominate vanished overnight practically. And then you had the mobile internet, which is a kind of massively inclusive trend in the global economy. And the mobile internet is not quite 20 years old. I mean, it's hard to believe that in less than 20 years, we've kind of, transformed so many things. But, I sort of became, through steps. I was watching the development of the financial sector and the e-commerce sector in China with help from friends there, because they were early in many dimensions of that. And I realized there were extremely important inclusive, growth patterns associated with that. And I just saw another version of it in India, which I think has one of the best, if not the best, sort of architecture for the digital financial part of the economy. We can go into that if you're interested. But and then, it was kind of anecdotal. I mean, two kids at Stanford, once the image recognition breakthrough occurred, this in the relatively recent past, decided to experiment with, partners in dermatology to see if you could use AI to detect skin cancer. And they worked pretty hard and assembled a training data set with just, I think, about 120,000 images. This is hard work, by the way. And then they trained the algorithm, and it did pretty well. The dermatologists agreed. It wasn't better than the dermatologist. And so then when I teach this in class, I say, but this is, potentially interesting. What do you think? And they say, well, it's interesting, but, it's not up to the dermatologist. So maybe it's not that important. And I say, why? And I say, well, they say, because I'm going to go to a dermatologist. These are kids that live at Stanford or in New York or Hamburg, right? And I say, yeah, but 85% of the world's population doesn't live anywhere near a dermatologist. And they say, oh, right. And I say, so, probably they're going to skip this aspect of, preventive primary care, if they've got to get on a train and go 100 kilometers to see a dermatologist. But if they get a warning from an AI, even if there's occasionally a false positive, they might do it. They might make the train trip if there's reason to, if it shifts the probabilities. I cite this because it's an example of a pretty powerful, and by the way, you can, somebody can take a picture of pretty much all of your skin and just send it in. And the AI does the job and sends you back a message saying you're fine, right? Or you're not. You better get this looked at. And by the way, it was not just picking off skin cancer; it was picking off skin cancer by type, right? So the dangerous ones like melanoma, get picked off. So anyway, that's an example of creative use of these things to improve people's lives. Will it change the growth trajectory? Probably not. But in another dimension that matters to people, namely their health, you can say the same things about education and all kinds of things. So the short answer is, I think for many of us, including me, the growing footprint, where you could get major benefits, both economic and other, from digital technologies has been steadily expanding as we've gone through the last 20 years in lots of dimensions. And but then I think, to be perfectly honest, I was pretty sure before Gen AI hit the world, about a year and a half ago, I guess now, it was November, I think. In fact, we were just finishing the first draft of the book, and all of a sudden it landed. And my subjective probability that we were going to get pretty big benefits from the application of digital technologies was basically went up a lot. And the reason is that is what we talked about before. It's the range of application. Gen AI is the first set of AI technologies that has the ability to change domains, has the human-like ability to change domains. All previous versions, worked in a very specific domain, recognizing images, doing something specific. Whereas Gen AI basically talks to you. If you talk about the Italian Renaissance, it knows what you're talking about. Then you switch to inflation. You don't have to say, I'm switching to inflation, flick a digital switch in there and go look up, sort of economic stuff. It just knows, right? What this means is, and the second thing is, you don't need technical training to use it. Anybody can use it, right? And so the combination of this domain switching, range of application, and accessibility is the underlying reason why I think many people believe that it just has enormous range of application, and hence the hoped for long run effects on productivity and multiple other things.
You just said that ChatGPT, for example, became known in 2023, last year, but it's still mostly viewed with suspicion. In your essay, The Coming AI Economic Revolution, you were rather positive about the future. For example, you wrote, by the beginning of the next decade, the shift to AI could become a leading driver of global prosperity. And you recently said, we live in an era of experimentation and exploration. That sounds very exciting. But where will it take us? If you let your imagination run wild, what prediction would you dare to make about AI in the next 10 years? Where will it be in 2034? That's what the book's about.
Yeah, no, so I think that's the right time horizon. So I think that, the short answer is nobody knows, because we're going to have to take the journey to get there. And we can do the best job we can, as regulators, as policymakers, as et cetera, getting there in the best way possible, by protecting people, by recognizing that, it's going to be disruptive, et cetera, by making the kind of public sector investments that are important. I mean, let me take an aside on that. The platforms and cloud computing systems that have the computing power to train the large language models and big Gen AI, they'll be multimodal in the not too. In fact, they already are. I think Sora is multimodal. Gemini is probably, becoming multimodal. So all of those platforms are in China and the United States. Europe needs one. I mean, for sure. I mean, it doesn't mean you're out of the AI revolution, because the applications don't require this kind of computing power. But I think an economic entity the size of Europe, probably ought to be part of the game, and an influential part of the game, right? Steering where we're going to go, just as Europe steers where we're going to go in climate change and the energy transition, where I think we desperately need European leadership. But that's an example. These are public sector investments. In the United States, there is no scientifically available cloud computing system that the research community can use. So they have to go to the Amazons and the Metas and the Googles and the Microsofts to get these things trained. So even in the United States, I think there's a multi-billion-dollar investment that's thoroughly justified in sort of getting ready for, for an inclusive kind of, we're going to kind of have everybody involved in this. The scientists are going to be part of it, et cetera, investments to make. And then you've got structural change, right? I mean, in the United States, we had a big infrastructure bill. And then we have the Chips and Science Act, a portion of which is designed to keep China down, and a portion of which is trying to bring the most advanced chip making capability to the United States in case we ever need to expand it. Well, at least the purpose is not to bring it all to the US, it's to bring enough so we know what we're doing if we have to expand it in the case the world goes in a direction none of us wants. But then there's a part that's, just basically, science and technology investment, and they're big. And then there's another one that, is a bit of a problem for the Europeans called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is basically an attempt to move forward on the climate change agenda, including the technology side. Those are big investments, right? But in a period where you need to thrive by enhancing structural change, those public sector investments are important. So I guess what I'm saying is that, what we were trying to do in the book is help people understand that this isn't business as usual, right? This is, I mean, in the United States, we basically thought industrial policy was nonsense until recently. And now I think the majority view, so there's still people who think it's nonsense because the government always makes mistakes or wastes the resources. But for the most part, I think people understand that when you have a period of structural change, you have multiple players in the game. The scientific community, the government is an investor, the private sector for sure is probably the proximate driver of all of this. And you need all the pieces together. I mean, one of the things that worries me about Europe is I don't think we're exempt here from, needing these structural changes to thrive over a 10-year period, which is the one you asked about. It's just that with this decentralized structure that we have, it's very hard to do a good job, efficient, and at scale job of making these public sector investments. So I'm on the side of people who say, look, I understand why you don't want full fiscal centralization, but at least centralize the things where it's essential. The big investments in science and technology that underpin these structural changes.
Are you familiar with Zora? You have ever heard of Zora, which is coming up from OpenAI?
Yeah, OpenAI's next big Gen AI model. I haven't had a chance to study its particular characteristics, but yes, I know.
Yeah, this is I think it's very easy that we will write down, let's play 3 golden retriever in the snow, and then the system is providing us a clip of 15 or 20 seconds, and you do not need anybody to produce it. And
that's right.
That means, and you wrote about the revolution for some people like the marketing industry, the ad industry, immediately the people who are right now doing this job to produce a spot, that they have no future. That makes that's a makeup artist, the cameraman, and all the creative people, that they say immediately, well, oh wow, the machine is doing my work. And if we are looking at the revolution you wrote in your essay, does it mean that a lot of people in this revolution won't have any future anymore? And you can't say to everybody of these people, maybe Hollywood, okay, go in the health industry. We have a lot of old people and work with old people, something like that, yeah?
No, that's the disruptive part. I mean, you just named the ones that everybody understands. So writing media copy, with or without images is, no, I don't know how to put it. I don't think they'll go out of existence, but we will need fewer people in that world. And there are lots of other examples that, the Hollywood people were concerned about. They were also concerned about the fact that the big Gen AI models just hoover up stuff on the internet with no particular concern about copyright protection or anything else, right? So those are all legitimate issues and challenges that have to be faced. So I don't want to paint the picture that it's just all rosy and everybody's going to benefit. Look, it's not confined to this. I mean, if we eventually sort of, eliminate coal, there's a whole lot of people in Poland not to mention other countries that have, have several generations of their family mining coal, right? So no, this is not, just all kind of beautiful. I think what I've tried to resist is the notion, that every line of work is just like writing media copy, right? So there's probably a kind of relatively stable demand for that kind of thing. I mean, you can imagine a world, like you can create a scenario in which there's a huge increase in demand, and probably the employment hit isn't all that big, but I don't believe that. But I run into this all the time. People, when they're thinking about the impact of big productivity changes, let's say big productivity changes that are not the same as full automation, they always assume the demand is fixed. That is, we need a certain amount of the output. If the people who produce that output are more productive, we need fewer people, right? So what I try to tell people is, well, yeah, there are sectors in which that's true, where the demand doesn't change very much, regardless of what the prices are. And that's probably a pretty good model. But, then we go to software. So software engineers are going to have digital assistants writing the first draft of various parts of the code. In fact, they already do. And then the question is, well, maybe we need fewer software engineers. But you have to think about the fact that we're building entire economies on software. And the proposition that the demand for software is fixed as we go through the next 10 years seems to me at least debatable, if not further. So I guess maybe that's an economist talking, but there are multiple dimensions to try to figure out what the impact is, and the automation sort of productivity effect is one of them, but it's not the only one.
The scenario could be, the pessimistic scenario could be that AI made a lot of things possible in 10 years, but too few people will earn the money to benefit from these possibilities.
Well, that's another issue. I mean, so, I generally think, and history supports this, that if you give people tools that make them more productive, eventually their incomes rise. That may not happen, overnight. I mean, that's pretty much the story of the Industrial Revolution. We've had adverse trends in income distribution because of a previous generation of AI, not AI, but digital, when we basically eliminated routine jobs. These are jobs where unlike the modern version of AI, where human beings knew how to do them, and we could describe exactly in steps how we did them, and then we could code it, and then the machine could do it, right? So we don't have any file clerks left, really, almost any. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the general ledger, which is the fundamental accounting document that, all businesses are based on, was kept by hand. I mean, written on paper. Well, it's all gone, right? Thanks to SAP and company. I mean, it isn't as if we haven't done this before. We've eliminated a lot of jobs with digital technologies, and we're probably going to eliminate a lot more or change them a great deal. And the process of getting from one equilibrium to another is not comfortable for many people. That's absolutely true. So I think, people sometimes wonder, well, in the aggregate, we don't have enough jobs. I think that's probably not too concerning, especially if you kind of give time for the adjustments. But at the microeconomic level, when a bunch of executives say, well, gee, I'm cutting people in this and that category because I'm going to, replace them with AI, and they'll discover down the road that the demand is growing and they need to get it back, right? Et cetera. I mean, all of that kind of, fumbling around, disruption of lives, jobs, business models, et cetera. That's all coming, for sure.
With AI, it is easier for us to solve problems because immediately all over the world, everybody has access and can do something. Do you think with this support we can have a solution for our energy problems?
I'm sure that AI is going to be a contributor to dealing with the energy transition, both the energy efficiency and the greening of the energy mix, both components being incredibly important. I mean, the AIs will run smart grids better than, than they're run now. They're not the whole solution, right? We can't say, well, geez, we finished because all we have to do is apply these things. We need material science, we need better batteries, we need, storage capabilities, backup, sources of power when the wind and solar, let us down. But one of the things I say in the book, so the straight answer is, AI is a major contributor in multiple areas of technology and science, including the energy transition, but it's not the whole story by any means. At least I haven't run into anybody who thinks it is. But one of the things that's happening is that, that makes me optimistic, that I do talk about in the book, or we do, is that there's a whole bunch of powerful technologies that are becoming available that have the characteristic that they're increasingly low cost. The costs are declining, unbelievably quickly, and they're accessible around the world. I mean, I'll give another example. It's probably not well known. So DeepMind, which is owned by Alphabet, Google, is based in London, and they're kind of famous for having just, got the machine to win the game of Go in two versions. The second one was sort of stunning because the second version, the machine played against itself and discovered strategies that no human has discovered. The reason this got people's attention is the game of Go, given current computer technology, has so many permutations that you can't, catalog them all, right? It's not possible. And so they still figured out a way for the machine to win against the world's best players. Their next project was called AlphaFold. And AlphaFold it'll sound nerdy to you, but they set themselves the goal, working with scientists, biologists, of predicting the three-dimensional structure of proteins from the amino acid sequence that defines a protein. And basically, after 2 years of hard work and experimentation, they pretty much succeeded. They're prediction machines. All of these things are prediction machines. They're not infallible. They say the 95% chance it looks like this, right? But figuring out that, first of all, it's crucial, because if you don't know what the protein looks like, it's really hard to tell what it'll bind to. So it's a core technology in pharmaceuticals, biomedical science, vaccines, anything. And it takes, months of a highly trained person in a lab just to do one. So once they got this done and realized it was working, they took the 200 million known proteins in the world, predicted all of their three-dimensional structures, and published the results in an open database that anybody in the world with the right training can access, and for free. Now that just strikes me, in the funny little world of biomedical science, is an enormous productivity enhancing, technology. I think we're going to see that story, written over and over again in various fields of science and technology. And I hope it turns out to be a major force. I mean, this story gets repeated. I mean, if you look at the cost of DNA sequencing, another core technology, it acted like Moore's Law for about 10 years, and then it just dropped like a stone. Made Moore's Law look like, slow progress. I mean, it's amazing. So a full DNA sequence now costs about $250. Started out at 10 million. So point is, there's a lot of talented, creative people in the world who and many motivated to solve important problems. I think the proposition I wanted to advance is they're being handed increasingly powerful tools to exercise their creativity in solving these problems.
A lot of specialists believe that there will be a new technology on the horizon, like quantum computers. And they are, I wrote it one time, that this Moore's Law on steroids, because it's so quick, it's so tough. Do you believe in this technology that will show up in the next years? Or how do you think about it? And what does it mean for us?
So, I don't know. I've tried to understand what the state of development of quantum computing is, and there's no question that it's been a very large amount of progress. But I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I haven't heard anybody say quantum computing looks like it's going to, solve the problem of training the large, models. And that's not what they say. They say, that it'll be chips like the NVIDIA chips and whatnot that kind of get the job done. So I'm not sure. I mean, I know that there's potential in quantum computing and it's enormously powerful. And if it succeeds, it'll be a threat, among other things, to pretty much every kind of security, digital security we have. So I don't think it's sort of to be dismissed. And from a kind of international competitive point of view, I mean, I think you have to take seriously that the Chinese are pretty advanced in among other areas in quantum computing. So, but I don't have a sense of how close we are to kind of having it have a large footprint in the parts of the world that where something that fast and powerful could make a difference. I mean, it's a little bit like nuclear fusion, right? Mm. I mean, there has clearly been progress. They can now sort of isolate these reactions for at least parts of a second, without blowing the building up, and that's something that for almost 70 years since World War II. We've been trying to do. I mean, so they are making. I mean, I went to Princeton. There was a high energy lab right outside of Princeton that was trying to solve this. Use nuclear fusion to generate electricity. It is if there's a complete solution, it is kind of a silver bullet, right? Because it's kind of pollution free. The waste from a nuclear fusion operation is water. So, and we can use water. So, but, I don't think anybody, and certainly not me, has a sense of, yes, we're making progress, but, are we 1, 2, 3, 5 decades, away from having a viable, alternative source of electric power? I think it's too hard to assess at this point.
Actually, we have an essay in the book from a quantum computer expert who says that one day there will be no more wars because the computers will anticipate every move of the opponent.
Well, that's fair.
Win a war. Because the quantum computers are so quick and they're better than the humans.
I mean, in lots of things that would be true. By the way, I think on international agreements, probably that were related to AI and things like drones and whatnot. I think one of the first items that would be useful to focus on is to eliminate by treaty the use of fully autonomous weapons. I think it's just crazy to go forward with competition in that area. I mean, we've done it with nuclear weapons and we did it with biological and chemical weapons. I don't see why we can't agree that, fully autonomous. I mean, I'm not talking about drones that are, flown by people 5,000 miles away. I'm talking about fully autonomous vehicles where there's an onboard system that decides what's going to happen on its own. I think that's too dangerous.
We see when technology is involved, we see very often that the prices are falling. And if we see the green technology, the green tech world, with green energy, that in the beginning is very expensive, and then later on we see that the prices are dropping. What does this development mean for a country like Russia, which is dependent on oil and gas? And does it mean that a country like Russia needs wars forever because they do not have anything else?
Well, I don't think war is much of a solution to this kind of thing, but you're right. I mean, so when you get technologies that have these cost characteristics that are really powerful, they drive structural change. If you don't make the structural changes, you stagnate. I mean, there's no question about that. So if Russia's dependence on fossil fuels becomes less kind of profitable as the energy transition moves forward, like every other country, they're going to have to find another way to drive economic growth. And they're certainly, fairly far behind in that. On the other hand, I mean, not to be excessively pessimistic, Russia is chock-a-block full with, human talent, right? I mean, there was a period of time when they had, some of the best software engineers in the world, not to mention mathematicians and other things. And why did, and one of the reasons they had the best software engineers in the world is the hardware wasn't very good. So they had to make up for it with the software. And so, I wouldn't write them off. I mean, we all have challenges in terms of governance, and we can take the wrong turn and go the wrong way. But in terms of fundamentals, I don't see any reason why Russia, with its human talent and its capabilities in science, technology, math, and other things, couldn't make this transition. I mean, it'd probably be pretty painful, but I don't think it's out of the question. I don't think they're condemned to a disastrous future just because oil and gas may not be as in demand in the future as they are now.
We were also talking about the role of Europe and now of Russia in the future. Currently, US and China are the AI pioneers. So if AI will change the world in the next 10 years, what does that mean for the future economic balance in the world?
Well, they're going to compete. I mean, we're going to compete. And part of the source of the geopolitical tensions is that, so if you stand back from the people in the AI world used to talk to each other all the time. And a significant number of them were Chinese. That's now completely bifurcated, right? They can't talk to each other at all. So at a kind of very fundamental kind of scientific level, the national security agenda, if you like, which is is increasingly prominent in affecting economic policies, is clearly injected itself in there. And then the United States is trying to deny China access to the chips that are used to train the biggest Gen AI algorithms. And China's doesn't have if you don't count Taiwan, the Taiwanese economy, it doesn't have fully advanced semiconductor capabilities. Actually, the most advanced semiconductor capabilities, I'm talking not about design, but fabrication, are in South Korea and Samsung and TSMC in Taiwan. Now that's going to change. Taiwan, TSMC is going to help the Americans best. They're going to essentially build a plant in Arizona. And eventually, I imagine, we'll have the capacity to produce 3 or 2 nanometer chips. It'll probably be more expensive than it is in Taiwan. At least Morris Chang, the founder of TSMC, says it's going to be more expensive, and I don't see any reason to disbelieve him on that. So you've got these two, players that are playing a pretty complex game because it isn't just economics, it's national security and strategic competition and whatnot. I think what's going on is both sides are, in one way or another, because they don't trust each other, are trying to limit the economic damage of this kind of competition. This is, on the American side, this is what Jake Sullivan calls this, a small garden with high walls. The small garden means we don't want the restrictions to kind of spread out to the whole economy, and all trade and all technology transfers and all international investment flows, just because, we don't want to share the full spectrum of stuff. So I think if they're successful, the policy makers and leaders on both sides, and Europeans have an important role in this, then I think, it'll be a more complicated world. We try to describe this in the book. We can't go back, to the world in which the entire global, economy was built on, comparative advantage and efficiency. I mean, it's the national security issues are just too important and complicated. And it's a really different world, right? I mean, businesses are diversifying in response to shocks and geopolitical tensions. The shocks are getting bigger and more. It's not irrational. Economic policy in the major players is pushing in the same direction, right? Diversify, bring some of it home, bring some of it near where we are, bring some of it to reliable trading partners, where we don't have to hit them with sanctions, etc. I mean, it's just relatively less efficient and much, much more complicated. In fact, for multinational businesses, they frequently find themselves in not only multiple regulatory regimes, but regulatory regimes that are actually contradictory. So it's hard to know, what you're actually supposed to do. And they're all trying to figure out a way to navigate that, and they're pretty good at it, but it's not easy. So I think all of that's inevitable. If you look out into the future, I think there's a scenario in which Europe becomes even more influential player in this by acting in certain dimensions as a unified entity, as it does in climate, for example. And then you've got India. I mean, India is like China in 2008, roughly, in per capita income terms, but it is a future economic giant. And what it does and how it interacts with everybody else is going to be an important part of the future. And we're not that far away. A decade and people will be talking about India as let me put it this way. It's the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide now, even though the per capita emissions are low. It's the fifth largest economy in the world, and they will pass you and Japan in the relatively near future at 7% or 8% growth rates. And then they'll be the third largest economy in the world. They'll still be way behind the United States and China. But then you come back to Europe. Europe is about the same size as the United States as an economy. So if it starts acting, on the international stage, with all the dimensions of the power that implies, then it's a very different world.
You mentioned China, you mentioned the semiconductor industry, and I hear a lot of voices say, if we are not anymore so dependent on the semiconductor industry from Taiwan, right now they are building up a factory in Arizona, and there is a possibility, an increasing possibility, that China will conquer Taiwan in the next 2 or 3 years. Do you agree with that? If there is no crisis, the world crisis of semiconductor, then it is free for China to attack Taiwan?
No, I don't think that's a scenario. I mean, I don't think we should reject it, and certainly should. The senior leadership in multiple countries shouldn't be doing irresponsible things that increase the likelihood of forcing China into doing something like that. And I don't know how to assess this, but I think the costs, in multiple dimensions, pretty much everywhere, of a full flat out, attempt. Well, they'd probably succeed eventually to sort of subdue Taiwan. I mean, even for the Chinese. I mean, I think a very large number of Taiwanese, don't want to do that. I mean, they're happy to be called part of China as long as they get to kind of keep going on in their own way. I mean, even let's suppose they won, took over China, they somehow the conflict with the rest of the world, including the U.S., was contained. Then they'd have to kind of govern Taiwan, right? And so I think their best bet is patience, right? Get to a point several decades from now in which the world looks different and people feel differently about the entities that they're kind of part of, and just be patient. So I guess if I had to summarize that, I'd say I still think people, policymakers in these countries are irrational, even when they sometimes make mistakes. And this one would look like on either side, almost like shooting yourself in the foot or maybe even the knee. So I don't think it's the most likely scenario. Shouldn't be dismissed. I don't think China doesn't need to go to war with, on the question of taking over Taiwan because they want TSMC. They'll find ways around this. They're investing massive amounts of money in building their own semiconductor industry. It's been tough. They haven't made that much progress, but they'll get there eventually. And I think that's a better answer than taking over Taiwan to try to get their hands on, even a very valuable semiconductor fab.
If we right now look in the future and say, oh, that's a scenario, we have a bunch of a few variables to put in the scenario. And do you believe that AI has more opportunities to have more than, I don't know, 100, 200 variables we can't even imagine, and to support us with a scenario and say one day, guys, I'm the technology, I know it much more better than you, and this is my solution. So that politicians say, ask AI for a solution, for example, for these problems. But we can't understand the solution anymore because we can't imagine so many, so we can't deal with so many variables. What do you think about it?
I think it's very unlikely. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a political person. I do admire, the best politicians because I think they do something that's very hard, which is find ways to bring people together to do important things. But I've never met a politician who thinks that a machine is going to do that job better.
No, of course not.
So, I can imagine a scenario in which we would get there, but seems a fairly long way off for now. And, I mean, the centrifugal forces, if you like, that are operating in multiple societies now, seem to be pretty powerful. So, I think a more serious concern is kind of subpar performance in politics and public policy for the next little while is a concern. Maybe the machines would do a better job, but not yet. Not, or as Tom Cruise said in his in the Top Gun Maverick, not today.
And then we have the other problem of the machine that they hallucinate. Do you think that is a serious problem for the future, that we believe much more in technology and don't realize that technology is wrong with hallucination?
So at some level, hallucination, can be dealt with just by partly technology. I mean, Bard, which is the earlier version of Google's thing, hallucinates. I mean, they asked it to write an essay on inflation, and at the end, it said, for further reading, you might want to look at the following 5 things, and it made them all up. And they were very plausible sounding titles. So, but I mean, you could give the AI the search mechanism so they can check, and so that's kind of one thing. So second, human beings are going to be smart about this. They know they'll hallucinate, they'll do something stupid a couple of times, but then they'll learn that if the machine can't check, they got to check if it matters. So I don't, a lawyer in the United States handed in a legal brief to the court that had been written by ChatGPT, and all of the legal precedents, were made up. And this gentleman got into fairly serious trouble as a result of this. And that story got around. I don't think too many lawyers are going to do that. So partly it's just kind of being smart. There's one actually serious aspect of this. Well, first of all, I've talked to several people who are in that kind of AI world who have talked to creative people, and you get a mixed reaction. Sometimes they worry they'll be replaced, but a lot of them say, I get new ideas precisely from hallucinations, from their ability to make stuff up that we haven't seen before. So I think there's an upside and a kind of a downside. But the serious problem is, for lots of purposes, we need to know how the AI reached the conclusion it reached, for accountability things, for dealing with things like bias and whatnot. And these are black boxes. And so there's an important, set of technological advances, and people are working on this, in which once it's figured out kind of some pattern that we hadn't thought about before, we need to be able to reverse engineer it somehow and figure out, how it did it. What was if you're an economist, what was the model that it discovered? that gave rise to these conclusions for basically for accountability purposes, right? You have to be, able to explain where the conclusion, how it reached the conclusion, right? Or made the prediction that it made. So that's an important dimension of this. It's not the same thing as hallucinations, but it's related to it because you want to know whether, in some sense, it's legitimate, right? And you can think of lots of applications of that. I mean, in business, you're using an AI. It did something. The question is, somebody objects. You go to court. Well, why did you do it? Well, the AI said we should do it, right? Well, that's not going to, somehow make it. So that's an important area of future research and needed advances.
Maybe one last question about Germany. Bloomberg recently wrote, Germany's days as an industrial superpower are coming to an end. Do you also see a dark future for us, or do you believe that Germany is one of the countries that will rise again?
No, I don't see a dark future, but I do think that, when I was working on, this is going to be an indirect answer to your question, but I think it's relevant, which is there's a lot of developing countries, find a successful growth model, and it produces pretty astounding results, right? In some cases you get 7% growth for a quarter century or more, but they get wedded to that model, right? And then they try to use the model when it's no longer, working or has the power that it had before. And so when people talk about the middle income trap, I often say, one of the reasons, countries in that category, emerging economies, end up slowing down is they try to use that early stage growth model when it's not the right model. And the successful cases like South Korea and whatnot that don't slow down are ones that change the model. And it's, and it's difficult. You have to change the model. You have to change the pattern of government, public sector investment. You need structural change. It's disruptive. There's all kinds of psychological reasons why people will try to say, well, we'll stick with this. So in the case of Germany, it is a powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse. I don't think, that the power of that in the German economy is going to go away like overnight. This isn't, a challenge. But I can't imagine a situation in which people say, well, we've got this Mittelstand, we've got, all these, capabilities. We've got a super automobile industry, even though it's a bit threatened by the EV version and whatnot. But it's still powerful enough and delay, the process of, training people and making public sector investments and starting the process of structural change. Because in the end, we're all going to have to do it, right? It doesn't matter who's first or second. We're going to live in a different, but these scientific and technological, transformations are in one way or another going to happen, or we'll all be, boiled in oil or something like that. So that would be my concern. And, and it's related to the fact that it's not just Germany, but Europe, I think, needs a little bit of centralization to make some of these big investments so that you don't have one or two countries trying to make them. And I don't mean to harp on this, but you need it's cheaper to fund it centrally, right? We're talking maybe 10% of the aggregate kind of fiscal spending or investment, but it needs to be administered centrally because it's got to go where it's going to have the biggest impact. And if the biggest impacts in Germany, and Poland and Albania don't get any of it, so what? I mean, the problem in Europe is that once you have a program like that, like the Recovery and Resilience Fund, it gets distributed to everybody kind of pro rata, and then they have to kind of make up a good plan, with guidelines like 25% has to be digital and 40 has to be the energy transition, and then the funds flow, if they're successful in that, to domestic entities. If we tried to do that in the United States, it would look like this. The United States central government, the federal government, stops funding research and all that kind of, and technology and all that stuff. And we say, we're going to do it by letting California and Texas and Massachusetts and New York do it. Well, will underinvest if we do that because they're not big enough. Even though California is bigger than all European economies except yours. And they'll focus it, and it'll be inefficient because they'll focus it within state, right? So, so Tennessee will get some of it, and they'll try to spend it in Tennessee, and that's probably not the best answer. So I think that's, if you put together the kind of the determination to kind of, be aggressive about, taking advantage of technology and structural change and do the kind of the right things at the European level. And I don't see any problem. And Europe is certainly not held back on the energy transition. It may have gotten out ahead, and probably, I ran into this in India. So I think, that the best answer to competitive problems is a kind of global price of carbon. We're not going to have that for a while. So we have to have the carbon border adjustment tax to protect European industry from, being out ahead, but being uncompetitive, vis-a-vis others who are kind of lagging in this respect. What the Indians are saying is, yeah, we understand, like, Europe has a carbon border adjustment tax because we don't have a tax on carbon. And so the best policy for us is put a tax on carbon or some price of some kind, because if we do that, the Indian government will get the revenues, and if we don't, the European Brussels will get the revenues from the carbon border adjustment tax. So I think slowly people are sort of getting the hang of it, that Europe's out ahead, and they're not going to jeopardize especially the heavy industry part, with just leaving them exposed to, environmentally unsound, steel production and other things all over the rest of the world. But anyway, I mean, that's a kind of, I'm not a pessimist about this, but I think there's a big job in sort of helping people. I don't detect in Europe a really urgent sense of, if you step outside in the climate change area, a really urgent sense, in the direction of, needing to kind of get together on, big things like a cloud computing system, make sure we're kind of not, we don't have to do everything. I don't think Europe has to sort of spend tens and tens of billions of dollars on semiconductors at this point. But a smart and pretty aggressive centralized approach to this, I think, would be helpful. And I don't, at least in the part of down here where I live, I don't sense a sense of urgency. I think people are a little bit too sanguine, about, well, we're kind of each doing our own thing. That's okay. I don't think that's right. You haven't asked me about China. I mean, the Chinese economy. You've asked if they're going to attack Taiwan and where are they technologically. That's okay if you don't want to.
No, we want. So come on. We want to know more about you, and well, how do you see China for the future? We are planning a trip in 2 months to China with a publisher, and so yeah, we are very curious. What do you think about this great country or this big country?
Well, so so there's the kind of, I guess, good and bad. So China, much of the world has an inflation problem and has a kind of supply constrained growth pattern. China is not. I mean, it's clearly, the opposite. China has an aggregate demand problem, and it's slowing them down. So where does this come from? Let me put time horizon on it. I think there will be a bit of a struggle in China with respect to restoring growth momentum, probably for the next 2 or 3 years, if they do the right things. So the most obvious one is the one everybody talks about, is the real estate sector. They've relied on it to excess in driving growth in the past. They have a huge amount of excess capacity. They've got financial distress in a pretty wide swath of the kind of developer community, and they're going to kind of have to clean that up and live with, trying to deal with the excess capacity while it eventually gets used up. So that's kind of point one. That'll slow them down. Secondly, the household sector is, if you look at their balance sheets, they're heavily dependent on real estate. That's where people invest. So if you've got trouble there and values go down, then you've got an almost automatic depressant on the consumption side of the economy, which is an important component. It's not as important as anywhere else in the world. I mean, structurally, China is unique in how low the household disposable income and the consumption side of the economy in terms of aggregate demand is. And they know that. So they know that structurally they've got to move that across. And then the smart people in the policy world know that if they just pull the investment lever, which they can, and they've done it in the past and it's produced some pretty good results, like an interstate highway system or the Autobahn and high-speed railway, you name it, at astonishing speed. But they're kind of running out of things to do in that capacity. And so if they just, do the kind of wrong kind of investment-oriented stimulus, they'll just create worse problems down the road. And finally, and the municipal governments, there's a major fiscal reform required. The municipal governments are really out of balance because, with a real estate situation, they can't sell land anymore to finance themselves, and they don't have enough revenue to kind of do the job they're supposed to do in terms of delivery of services. So they need a major kind of fiscal reform, and they have changed their mind so frequently on the regulation of the private sector. We hammer them one day, tell them we need them the next. That the private sector is, I think, a little bit, there's been a loss of confidence. They don't really know what their place in the sun in that system is under this administration. And so they're underinvesting as well. I mean, some of this capital leaving. This is domestic investors and companies are underinvesting. The foreigners, divide into two categories. There's the ones who are staying because the opportunities are great. And the ones who have decided, it's uninvestable and they can't figure it out, or the national security law is too vague to be, a kind of guideline for what you can and can't do, and we just give up and leave. It's like there's a split in that dimension. I don't think any of these things are fatal flaws. And the Chinese growth potential is enormous. They've made enormous investments in, university education, human capital. They're a powerhouse in science and technology in multiple dimensions. There's a huge entrepreneurial ecosystem in biomedical and biotech operations that people are, domestic and foreign entities are investing in. That's the kind of good and the bad. The bad is they've got 3 years of sorting out some pretty major imbalances and restoring confidence. They have some headwinds they didn't have before. They got youth unemployment. They have a population that's actually declining now. I mean, because of the earlier one-child policy kind of dynamics and keeping it in place for too long. The workforce is shrinking. And again, I don't view these as fatal, but they're, important, headwinds that weren't there in the heyday of kind of China's growth. And the bottom line is a lot of people are pessimistic about China. I would say they've got some major challenges to deal with in the next 2 to 3 years. They got a lot of smart people who know what they're doing. If they let them do their job, they'll solve these problems, and they're longer term, for a very high middle income country. This is a country with a per capita income of 13,000 roughly dollars, and the major cities are kind of high income places. I don't see any reason to be on purely economic grounds, even slightly pessimistic. I think they can restore, reasonable potential growth of 5% for the next decade or so. I think they can get there, and the things that are missing in many countries that get to that stage, you can find lots of examples if you go around the world. The intangible assets that you really need to grow. China's not missing those things; they're all there. So it'd be interesting to figure out what you find out when you get there.
Yeah, they feel very lonely right now because it's difficult for them to find some friends, especially of the geopolitical situation. And but yeah, it's interesting because everybody thinks normally they have a master plan, and especially in AI and so on. And so we met, for example, the CEO of the telecom and said, okay, with the sanctions we are doing, we motivate China to do better, especially in the semiconductor field and all this stuff. I think they are leading. I was in the CES in the US in Las Vegas, and I think it was a lot of Chinese companies were there with innovation and not as copycats. 20 years ago, they went to a festival with cars with a photo, and they took photos of everything to learn. And now they are in the leading position in different technologies.
Absolutely. No, there's no question. I mean, solar energy.
Yeah.
I mean, electric vehicles, battery. Lots of parts of AI. They were clearly ahead in aspects of, e-commerce and digital finance with the QR codes. This is a powerhouse technologically. There's absolutely no question about that. And that really distinguishes it, from other economies at similar levels of per capita income. So yeah, I think I talked to some of the people at Lenovo earlier this year. I mean, they're an enormously innovative company. They're going to put AI in the PC by the end of the year, right? And they're probably by now the most important non-Apple PC player in the world. And by put AI, I mean, they'll have a CPU and a GPU and an MPU all in your laptop. I mean, it won't be a cloud computing. I mean, yeah, and solve problems like hybrid models that business needs, with the cloud on the one hand, but some highly sensitive proprietary data maintained locally. And, so, basically a model, that involves lots of data and computing power that really works for business. I mean, I think you look in the white goods industry, I mean, their products are really innovative, drones,
Yeah.
I mean, every time you turn around, there's an example of this. I'm sure you'll visit Shenzhen.
Yeah, we do.
You'll see a lot of this. But anyway, yeah, on that score, I completely agree. And I've spent a lot of time in China, and what you're being told by the people inside is absolutely right. So it's like the rest of us. I mean, the question is, does the governance model turn loose all of the technological, economic, and power or not? And that's harder to guess, but I mean, the potential is certainly there.
We are facing or challenging one of the biggest problems is the climate change. And I think we need China for having a solution. Do you think we will have a solution? And when our book is focused on 2034, in 10 years, that everybody's realizing that we have to do something together with technology and every country in the world?
Basically, yes. I think we will. I mean, I think we're making progress. We're behind, because it's hard. And so we'll have climate change for sure. But I mean, to be specific, Europe is coming down in terms of, carbon intensity of the economy at a reasonably rapid rate. That'll probably accelerate. The United States, from a very high level, is coming down. If the election goes a certain way in the United States, that could get disrupted, and that would not be good. China's the largest emitter as a country in the world by a factor of 2, with the United States being second. So if they dropped out, basically there'd be no solution, but they aren't going to drop out. And they're probably going to peak in carbon emissions earlier than anybody in history, before the end of this decade. I mean, that's the prediction, and most people that know what they're talking about think that's a realistic possibility. They set the goal of peaking before 2030, or by 2030. It looks like they'll get that job done. I mean, the wild card, is India because it has a huge amount of growth in front of it. And well, its per capita emissions are low. Its total emissions, because of the huge population, are very high. And so if we're going to solve this problem, we have to find a way, working with India, for them to basically go through a trajectory that's different from anything we've seen before, where carbon emissions start to come down way earlier in the development cycle. Having said all that, I think there's at least a chance that, not that will we meet the targets that the International Energy Agency and others have set to prevent climate increases above 1.5 degrees Celsius? I doubt it. I mean, especially the short run targets. So that's why I think we'll have climate change, and we'll have to deal with it, and risk associated with that. But that doesn't mean we won't kind of eventually get to solving the problem working together. I mean, from my point of view, the key question is, will the major players, engage and drive the change? And by the major players, I mean, the top 10 emitters, because they account for most of the carbon emissions. I mean, if you have all the developed countries, so the United States, Canada on the North American side, Europe, India, China, Japan, etc. Going at this aggressively, you're dealing with a fairly large amount of the problem. I don't mean to dismiss the rest of the world, but they're not, if you do the math, I mean, they don't account for most of the emissions. So it's pretty easy to figure out whose emissions have to come down fairly quickly if we're going to solve this problem. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, 15 years ago in the emerging economy world, if you brought the subject up, they sort of thought it wasn't interesting. There wasn't much engagement. I mean, the policymakers understood, but the people didn't. But now with these climate events and a whole lot of education that's occurred, the level of engagement globally seems to be, even if we haven't solved all the problems, including distributional ones, who's supposed to do what when, it's at least you have the engagement, which is a kind of prerequisite for making progress. So yeah, I think the next decade will show some pretty dramatic progress. Whether it's enough, it's hard to say, but definitely going in the right direction, with Europe as an important leader.
But that sounds good that there will be progress. Normally, if you solve a problem, you cause another problem. And
Fair enough.
Yeah, and right now in Ukraine and with the war in Ukraine and Russia, lots of people, soldiers die. Do you think there will be a mass migration of women and children after the war, because there are 200,000 or I don't know how many soldiers have died, and so people say, okay, go west, go somewhere else, especially
I don't know, but that could happen. I can imagine. I mean, the destruction of everything, dwellings, infrastructure, and whatnot is just stunning. So yeah, that's easy to imagine. I would think, I mean, people still, probably want to live, where they feel like is home. So I can imagine if we could find a way to stop this war, and then there was a big multinational effort to help them rebuild, then I can imagine that would mitigate that effect. I think if the war stops at some point or just grinds on, and there's no attempt to kind of restore prosperity in the Ukraine, then I think you could, and people eventually will give up and say, well, at least my kids have to have an opportunity to do something somewhere else, and then they'll go. So I think that points to unfortunately, nobody that I know has a solution to how to stop this thing.
So but at least we need something positive to finish our conversation.
Okay.
You have something for us that makes you positive, that said, okay, that could be interesting for the future, technology, AI, to say, wow, we are happy for it. We are looking forward for it.
Yeah, so I think we've talked about it. I think the good news is that, we are, I guess I just have to call it lucky. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution, basically the growth has been driven by the application of science and technology. And now we have these incredibly powerful tools. So, I mean, I think the biggest challenges are not really economic and not really technology. They're political, right? Do we have I often use this rather ridiculously simple framework for try figuring out, whether some entity or some country or something is going to do something. So I always ask myself, do they have the resources? Do they have the competence? And they have the will? Okay, so resources seem to me, in the dimensions we're talking about, to be extraordinary. And competence, there's a ton of, talent lurking around in the world. So frequently the direction that we go, at least as I see it now, has to do with whether or not we have the political will or not, to move in productive and in directions that improve people's lives and reduce risk and increase security and all kinds of other things. I hope the answer to that is yes, but I mean, if you're a determined skeptic, there's a fair amount of ammunition you can muster around the world to suggest that we seem to, have a gift for finding ways of, sort of getting lost and going off in the wrong direction for a while. So hopefully not. I read a book by Rohini Nilekani recently and just wrote my Project Syndicate article on it. She's Indian, philanthropist, author, at times journalist, and her proposition is that the kind of core to dealing with these problems is actually not governance and not the markets. It's the society, the institutions and values and stuff that kind of ultimately drive it. And so she says this is society first, not just because, in the end, that's what all this stuff is about, is making people's lives as good as they can be, but because that's the ultimate corrective mechanism. When something goes wrong, the markets are producing too much inequality or something, and the governance starts to go wrong. It's whether or not the society has a kind of, not, formal, but a kind of a way of resisting, pushing the thing back. I thought it was a very interesting perspective that affected my thinking a bit, because, at least in America, we talk a lot about, whether our political system's constructed right, have we created a situation that produces political polarization to to a greater extent than we need, and so on. But I thought this notion that are we really kind of put together as a society was a pretty interesting perspective as well.
You write in your essay that this challenging times we need politicians who manage the situation. Do you think we have the right politicians? Because you have to deal with this AI, with all this stuff, and it's very difficult to understand what does it mean for the future. Do you think that the political leaders know what to do, or do they think still in the question of the 80s and 90s and they can't deal with this current situation?
No, it's a mixed picture. I mean, I think when you have something as new as what we've been talking about for much of this hour, I don't think anybody kind of feels like they're fully on top of it. This is a question of discovery. So, I mean, I know President Biden in the United States has gone out to California and sat down and listened to the people who are building AI, to try to, advance his understanding of it. And I'm sure that kind of thing is happening all over the place. And so that's good. I mean, that's good news, but it doesn't mean everybody's on top of everything all the time. I mean, I think there are problems. I mean, in the United States, it looks like in the next presidential election, we'll have two people running for office. They're very different. We don't know the outcome, but they're both pretty old, So, I mean, I can say that because I'm kind of similar in age these guys. I don't think it's ideal, to have the politicians, especially the senior leadership in the country, be, kind of two generations away from the younger group. So what I don't know how to get there, but I think we need, at least on the American side, we need a transition to a younger generation of leaders, right? Ones whose experience is different, ones whose, connectivity with the younger people in the economy is greater, just kind of by nature, etc. I don't know. As I say, I don't know how we're going to get there, but I think that would be an important positive, an important positive change.
How do you manage it to be connected with all those questions of the present, of the future? Do you read every day? Do you talk to people? What is your advice to everybody who is listening to us?
At least in my case, it's interest, it's reading, it's visiting. When I have the opportunity, as I did, and I hadn't been in India. My previous trip to India was as the pandemic was starting. I was in Gujarat in Ahmedabad at the Indian Institute of Management when a friend of mine was there. I went home and the world blew up. I mean, in the sense of the pandemic. But before that, I hadn't been in India for, it was at least 2 or 3 years before that. So I was feeling pretty out of date in a country that's sort of made some very major progress in lots of ways, at least on the economic side. I know there's, political divisions and, issues that, I think foreigners probably shouldn't sort of comment on. I think Indians have lots to say about the way their society is put together. But so it's partly, I think, it's a combination of things, and then maybe just curiosity. I mean, if people wanted advice, I would say, regardless of what field you're in, this is probably a good time not to sit on the sidelines when it comes to some of these technologies, especially AI. I think people in business and so on have kind of figured this out. They don't want to be a spectator on this one, even if they don't jump in with both feet. I mean, I can easily understand reaching the conclusion that, you don't kind of go whole hog until you kind of figured out what it's got to do with you and your company, you and your institution, etc. But sort of active engagement in figuring that out strikes me is the kind of right posture. And I think it's the posture the vast majority of people that I know actually take. I may do various things, but one of the things I do is I sort of try to spend some of my time in and around people who manage assets and make investments, because they have a very specific, concrete set of objectives, figuring out which things are going to be good return investments. And for an economist, at least, I find that perspective very useful. In economics, there is the positive and the normative side, but we have a little bit of a tendency to switch back and forth without, sort of paying attention. When you're an investment manager, you don't have the luxury of kind of wishing the world were somehow different than the way it is. You kind of take it as it is. And so I find that perspective, and the ability to, spend time with those folks is very helpful.
Do you have a person who inspires you a lot, which you look back and say, wow, that was somebody who was really fantastic? You can drop a name or two.
Well, I was really lucky. I mean, I had 3 when I did my PhD thesis, which was related to the work that ended up getting the Nobel Prize. I had 3 wonderful advisors. 2 of them are no longer with us. But all 3 of them are very special. They were Kenneth Arrow, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, and then Thomas Schelling was a truly creative, innovative guy, game theorist, kind of the architect or one of the important architects of the conceptual framework that allowed us to get through the nuclear age and the Cold War. And then Richard Zeckhauser. At the time, they were all at Harvard. I've always looked up to them. and been inspired by, their work, their humanity, their creativity, and so on. Don't think I'm up to that standard, but yeah, they were role models for me.
Thank you very much for this wonderful interview.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.